Here's a fact that'll shake up what you think about ancient Egypt. A woman accused of speaking too boldly could have her nose slit or her ears cut off. Not by criminals, but by temple-sanctioned officials. These weren't random acts of violence. They were punishments approved by religious authorities to purify women deemed spiritually out of line with their families. Sound barbaric? That's because it was. But why is this side of Egypt's past almost invisible today? Later in this episode, we'll see how the erasure playbook worked. For now, let's look at the belief system that made these punishments possible. Let's talk about one of history's biggest spiritual cover-ups, the so-called cosmic balance of ancient Egypt. On the surface, it sounds peaceful, everyone in harmony, the universe ticking along like clockwork. But for women, Mahat wasn't about peace. It was a system that let men turn any household squabble into a holy crisis. If a wife talked back, questioned an order, or just annoyed her husband, temple authorities didn't see a family argument, they saw an offense against the gods. Temple inscriptions describe husbands in godlike terms, giving them unchecked authority over their homes. One Theban document records a husband invoking Ra before punishing his wife as if divine approval made the beating righteous. Some texts describe punishments like locking women in dark rooms, all justified as restoring cosmic balance. The message was clear: whatever the man decided, the gods were on his side. What did it take to be labeled a threat to harmony? Almost nothing. A Memphis case punished a wife for a sideways glance at dinner. Another court record tells of a woman whipped for arguing about money. Her crime was labeled an offense against Ma'at. Basically, if a husband felt slighted, he could call it a spiritual emergency and call in the temple officials. The aftermath was just as grim. Temple healing texts describe women coming in after punishments, some with the Ankh symbol branded into their skin to remind her of life's balance. It wasn't just about pain, it was about making the punishment look sacred, like a ritual instead of abuse, and the humiliation didn't stop at the body. A Demotic text tells of a wife forced to kneel outside her home, chanting for weeks, "I am the disorder, my husband is the truth." Public shame was part of the process. This wasn't rare either. Records show dozens of women facing harmony corrections every month. Scribes kept logs of these punishments, listing voice crimes like speaking out of turn or disagreeing with a husband. In some communities, punishments became group events, with multiple wives whipped one after another while a priest declared, "As her blood falls, so order rises." It was all written down, as if bookkeeping for the gods. For years, Egyptologists painted Ma'at as a beautiful philosophy. Early translators glossed over the violence, calling these punishments domestic rituals. But new discoveries, like a New Kingdom ostracon describing a nose-slitting by holy right, show what was really going on. Ma'at wasn't about keeping the universe in balance. It was a cosmic excuse for total control. And if you think women just accepted it, think again. Amulet receipts show women buying charms against the wrath of household gods. A polite way of saying, "Please stop my husband from hurting me." Even love spells sometimes beg the gods to soften my lord's hand. It sounds sweet until you realize what they were really asking for. So next time someone talks about the wisdom of ancient Egypt, remember the ugly reality behind the cosmic lie. And this was just the start. In some cases, punishment wasn't just private, it became a full-blown community event. Now picture what happened when punishment moved into the street. Priests and husbands used reed whips dipped in ox blood to deliver exactly 40 public lashes, not hidden away, but right outside the house where everyone could see. Ritual manuals mention mixing sacrificial blood with oil and temple dust, turning a beating into a kind of grim religious performance. The pain was only part of it. The real spectacle was the crowd. Legal texts from Edfu spell it out. No household shall close their doors during the correction. That meant neighbors, friends, and even strangers had to watch. Scribes wrote about crowds gathering as for a festival, with children forced to sit up front and sometimes even rub salt into the wounds. Neighbors didn't just watch. They were expected to participate, throwing shards of pottery or shouting curses, making sure the humiliation stuck. Priests kept the ritual going between lashes, chanting lines like, "Let her flesh remember what her mind forgets." Why make it such a public event? Fear works best when everyone witnesses it. Some marriage contracts from Memphis and Thebes actually included clauses stating that if a wife disobeyed, Her punishment would take place where the market women pass. The message was clear. This wasn't just about correcting one woman, it was about warning every woman who saw or heard about it. In Elephantine, evidence shows crowds drummed during punishments, drowning out screams and turning beatings into a kind of twisted ceremony. Priests claimed these bloody whips purified women, that the ox blood carried away defiance. Pain became a test of spiritual endurance, but blood-soaked whips were just the beginning. Next, women faced permanent branding marks. Walking through an Egyptian market with a scar burned into your cheek wasn't just painful, it was a public label that marked you as impure. The branding ritual made women into living warnings. Priests used bronze rods, heated until they glowed in the temple fires, to sear marks into the skin. The meaning was clear to everyone. This woman had crossed a line and would carry the evidence for the rest of her life. Temple manuals from Abydos spell out what each symbol meant, so there was no confusion in the community. Social consequences hit just as hard as the pain. If you were branded, you might get moved to the edge of the village, living in a hut with other marked women. Archaeologists find their graves with broken mirrors instead of the usual amulets, almost like they were supposed to remember their shame even in death. One grave near Giza included a pottery shard scratched with, "I deserved my face." There's no happy ending here. The aftermath was ugly. Infections set in fast. Medical scrolls describe how salves made things worse, turning wounds into open sores that sometimes never healed. What's really disturbing is how normal this was. Work records from Deir el-Medina mention branding alongside chores. Branded so-and-so's wife today? Send linen. A mummy in Turin still shows the disobedience mark burned deep into her cheek, misidentified for years as a tattoo until modern scans revealed the truth. All this effort for a scar you couldn't hide. A broken bone might heal, but a branded face told your story forever. It was a punishment designed to follow you through every moment of your life. And as brutal as branding was, it wasn't the end of the line. Some punishments went even further, cutting away defiance at the source. When it came to silencing women for good, ancient Egyptian punishments didn't hold back. Nose-slitting wasn't just some random act of cruelty, it followed a brutal logic meant to stamp out defiant voices. If a woman spoke too loudly or argued too much, priests used sharp bronze blades and chanted ritual incantations as they cut vertical lines from nostril to upper lip. The wounds didn't just bleed, they never fully healed, leaving women with constant pain and a face everyone would recognize. Ear cutting was just as calculated. Priests sometimes removed lobes first, then entire ears for repeat offenses. The official line was that ears invite wicked words, so taking them away protected a woman's ka from corruption. In other words, if you couldn't hear, you couldn't pick up rebellious ideas. Some accounts even suggest husbands kept the severed parts as twisted trophies, reminders of their authority. These punishments weren't hidden away. They happened right at temple gates, often during festivals when the crowds were thickest. It wasn't just about the pain, it was about making sure everyone saw what happened to women who spoke out. Priests didn't even try to hide the pain. After the cutting, they'd rub a nasty paste of salt, vinegar, and ground limestone into the wounds to keep them from healing. Medical journals from Memphis describe how these wounds had to be reopened every week for months. One entry tells of a woman who bled to death after her nasal cavity was sliced open. The goal wasn't just disfigurement, it was ongoing suffering. The excuses for these mutilations could be as petty as shrill tones during weaving. Ritual manuals sometimes defended nose slitting as less severe than execution, arguing it preserved the woman's fertility. One scroll even claimed that removing ears would free a woman from distracting sounds so she could focus on her chores. That's the kind of logic you get when control is the real goal. The scars lasted a lifetime. Archaeological finds show mummies with healed nasal cuts and teeth worn down from mouth breathing. Some skulls have multiple cut marks, proof that the punishment was repeated every time the wound started to heal. In society, the damage was just as permanent. Census lists from workmen's villages sometimes grouped noseless women together. Letters reveal that these women struggled to remarry. One suitor even wrote he'd rather take a branded wife than a mouth breather. Caught between humiliation and permanent scars, these women faced even darker fates in temple vaults. Temple vaults in ancient Egypt were more than just dark rooms. They were punishment chambers designed to erase a person from the inside out. Archaeologists have found these claustrophobic underground chambers beneath major temples, some barely wide enough to turn around in and with ceilings so low you had to crouch. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs repeating the same lines over and over. Silence is purity. Darkness reveals truth. Not that anyone locked inside could see a thing. These places weren't about justice. They were about breaking the spirit. Priests kept careful records of who went in and for how long. Most women sentenced to the vault spent 7 days in the dark, but some records describe an extended imprisonment of several months for repeat offenders. One entry from Edfu mentions a woman who was left so long she gnawed her own fingers. That wasn't rare. Women often emerged with chewed lips, raw hands, and haunted eyes. The psychological torture was the point. Food was just enough scraps to keep them alive, sometimes nothing more than a crust of bread thrown through a slot in the door. Water came from licking condensation off the stone walls. Guards didn't just ignore the suffering, they made it worse, scraping their own meals against the door so the prisoner could hear what she was missing. The official records called this encouraging reflection. Most women confessed to anything just to get out. Legal texts from Deir el-Medina list all sorts of sins women admitted to after time in the vaults: petty theft, wishing their husbands dead, even crimes that happened years before they were born. Priests loved to call these voluntary confessions. In reality, these women were physically and mentally broken by the time the doors opened. Some never made it out at all. Worker logs from Karnak mention removing bodies from the vaults under cover of darkness so as not to disturb the temple's peace. The women who died there were dumped in common graves. No amulets, no prayers, just a scrap of papyrus in their mouths reading, "unclean." Why go to all this trouble? Because the silence that came out of those vaults was worth more than any scar. Husbands wrote to priests saying their wives returned as quiet as a stone god. Temple texts called this transformation the Great Peace, claiming the vaults made women into perfect wives who speak only when the gods command. The evidence is everywhere. Archaeologists at Medinet Habu found walls scratched with tallies, desperate apologies, even just a single word repeated over and over: sorry, obey, or a name written again and again until the stone wore down. The deepest scratches are near the floor, where women curled up for days at a time. Even after release, the damage lasted. Modern scans of mummies show bone loss from starvation, ears damaged by the silence, and jaws locked from stress. Some hands are frozen into claws from months of scraping stone. For most women, this was the end of the line. But for Egypt's upper class, punishment took a different turn, one that looked a lot more comfortable, but was just as effective at keeping women in their place. For wealthy women in ancient Egypt, punishment didn't mean whips and branding irons. It meant being locked away in so-called luxury chambers, rooms that looked impressive but stripped away every basic freedom. Archaeologists have found these spaces next to family tombs, beautiful carvings on the walls, maybe a gemstone floor, but no light and no way to open the door from the inside. The message was clear: you can have all the beauty in the world, but you're not going anywhere. One noblewoman's chamber near Thebes got special mention in a scribe's account from the reign of Ramses III. The room had polished stone floors and a single air shaft that let in just enough wind to howl through at night. Meals arrived through a slot in the wall, and each delivery came with a servant reciting her list of supposed offenses. The only object inside was a bronze mirror, not for vanity, but for catching a minute or two of sunlight each day. Rules for these retreats were strict and meant to mess with your mind. Women received writing materials, but no ink, perfume, but no water to wash. The point wasn't physical pain, it was isolation and frustration, with every comfort twisted into a reminder of what they'd lost. One letter from a nobleman to his wife, found in a family archive, reads, "May the scent of your unwashed flesh teach you what your ears refused." Some temple logs even mention women developing sensory problems after months in these rooms, a permanent aversion to certain fabrics or sounds. The punishments for elite women were designed to disappear without a trace. Unlike the scars of peasant punishments, these left no marks on the skin. Instead, the erasure happened on paper and stone. Tomb paintings were edited to remove the woman's image. Family trees were redrawn with her name scratched out. A vizier's file from Abydos includes orders like remove the lady from all feast scenes, and paint over the offending daughter in the mural. It was social death, carried out in slow motion. Even the food was a tool for control. On the surface, the menu was rich: honey cakes, spiced wine, roasted meats, but medical scrolls reveal that everything was laced with mild laxatives or emetics. The goal was to keep the prisoner weak and uncomfortable, no matter how fancy the plate looked. Some families didn't stop at isolation. At Saqqara, archaeologists found a noblewoman's chamber with false doorways painted on the walls. Her diary, scratched into a copper bowl, counted over 1,000 failed attempts to open them. Others reported hallucinations after months alone, convinced they saw or spoke with erased ancestors. Death didn't bring relief. Some elite burials were deliberately cursed, names written upside down, sarcophagi sealed with extra stones, or spells left unfinished. The idea was to keep these women from returning, even in memory. Wealth didn't buy mercy. It just meant the walls were prettier and the silence more complete. The real cruelty was knowing exactly what you'd lost, watching your own story disappear from the world around you. But the cruelest classroom of all? Using children as witnesses and enforcers. In ancient Egypt, kids weren't just bystanders to punishment. They were part of the process. Young children were often forced to watch as their mothers or sisters were beaten or branded. Temple records mention groups of children sitting cross-legged during public punishments, with scribes noting that the mind is soft wax at a young age. Sometimes kids were made to hold the whip after the beating or even brand their sister's doll as a twisted lesson. The impact of these lessons ran deep. One adult recalled brutality from childhood haunting him decades later. He described seeing his aunt punished in front of him and never forgetting the patterns her blood left in the dust. Another man wrote about nightmares that followed him into adulthood after witnessing priests force-feed his mother dirt. The message was clear. This is what happens if you break the rules. And for many, those childhood memories shaped how they treated women in their own families later on. Schools didn't offer any relief. Writing tablets from Elephantine show boys copying lines like, "The obedient woman's house stands, the loud woman's bones scatter," over and over. Teachers made girls recite chants about keeping silent, while boys practiced drawing up fake marriage contracts with punishments listed for every possible offense. The line between education and indoctrination was razor thin. Religious festivals made things worse. Priests staged mock trials where children played the parts of accused women, judges, and even executioners. One mural at Karnak shows toddlers lined up with miniature reed switches, the caption reading, "The gods smile on early lessons." Some parents took this even further. Records mention a father making his young daughter hold a hot coal to prepare her for womanhood. The idea was to make punishment a normal part of growing up, something you expected to see and even participate in. The effects didn't stop with childhood. Grave inscriptions brag about family lines with no insolent women in 14 generations, and dolls passed down through the years show tiny scars carved into their faces, matching the real injuries suffered by female relatives. Archaeologists have found miniature branding irons and whips buried with children, not as toys, but as tools of the system. One girl's grave included a doll with scars that matched her mother's facial brands and a pottery shard scratched with "Good Daughter." A few tried to resist. A rare letter from a daughter to her punished mother speaks of keeping her mother's voice alive in secret. Another woman taught her child hand signals after losing her tongue. But these stories are rare. Most kids grew up policing moms, reinforcing this culture for centuries. The system didn't just punish women, it trained the next generation to keep the cycle going. This was the foundation for a world where accusation alone could destroy a woman's life. Suspicion alone could wreck everything for a woman in ancient Egypt. The legal system didn't care about proof or fairness. If a husband or neighbor accused a woman of anything, no matter how small, her fate was sealed. Husbands' accusations carried godlike weight, and a judge's job was to take their word as sacred. In one court record, a woman named Henutawi got branded just because her husband claimed she smelled like another man. No evidence, no questions, just punishment. The kinds of accusations women faced were almost laughable if they weren't so cruel. One legal text from Memphis describes a wife exiled because her husband said she cursed him by making the bread too salty. Priests loved to use divine signs as proof. If a sacrificial goat trembled during a hearing, that was enough to convict. If a priest's wig fell off while a woman spoke in court, that was considered a sign from the gods that she was guilty. The bar for evidence was so low, it might as well not have existed. Trials were a joke. Women couldn't call witnesses or defend themselves. Instead, they were forced to stand barefoot on hot tiles, supposedly to test their truthfulness. The pain was meant to make them confess, but it really just made them suffer. Court records from Abydos show verdicts delivered in a matter of minutes: accusation, pain test, and then straight to punishment. Scribes even practiced writing guilty and more guilty on ostraca, as if there was never any other outcome. Rumors spread fast, and the fallout was brutal. Letters from women like Isis, who was run out of her home for supposedly glancing at a sailor, show just how quickly a life could fall apart. Her family's response? Better rats than shame. Even after death, women could be punished. One tomb inscription brags about erasing a mother's name because her ghost was too chatty. It didn't matter if the accusation was real, just that it was made. Children's words could be just as deadly. In one case, a 7-year-old's claim that his aunt made ugly faces at daddy led to her nose being slit. Another record rewards a daughter with honey cakes for accusing her mother of thinking bad thoughts. The system thrived on accusations, no matter how petty or outrageous. A dump pit at Deir el-Medina held broken dishes with women's names scratched beside made-up crimes. Neat stole air. Tawaret's shadow was long. The message was clear. It didn't take much to get labeled guilty. Why did this system survive for so long? Because it kept everyone scared. When any whisper could lead to punishment, women watched their every move and even turned on each other to stay safe. Priests bragged that accusations saved the labor of watchmen. The real power wasn't in the law, it was in the fear that came with it. You won't find these stories in the official histories. Once women were silenced by law, history itself joined in hiding these crimes. Let's talk about why you've heard all about Cleopatra, but almost nothing about the brutal punishments that ordinary Egyptian women faced. That's not a coincidence. Early Egyptologists loved the golden glory version of history. Anything that didn't fit, like temple records describing nose slitting, got rebranded as ritual beautification. Branding irons, cataloged as cosmetic tools. Some early dig reports even explained whip marks on mummies as evidence of grooming gone wrong. When you're determined to keep things shiny, it's easy to ignore the ugly parts. The erasure didn't stop with museum labels. Nobles paid artists to paint over the women who'd been punished. At Luxor, infrared scans revealed a noblewoman's image hidden under layers of plaster, her nose clearly slit in the original painting. In the British Museum, there's a family mural where someone scratched out a daughter's face but forgot to erase her shadow. These ghost women aren't rare. Once you know what to look for, they show up everywhere. Official records had a habit of disappearing too. Sometimes scrolls about punishments were quietly burned, tossed in storerooms, or recycled for other uses. Archaeologists have found branding rods mixed in with miscellaneous metal tools. At Karnak, a storeroom of punishment records was destroyed because the contents were called distasteful. The less people saw, the easier it was to pretend none of it ever happened. Museums played their part in keeping these stories buried. Some still store punishment tools and diaries off display, tucked away in crates labeled domestic items. One curator in the 1950s admitted the truth. Tourists prefer perfume bottles. Even now, a noblewoman's diary describing her time in a locked chamber sits in storage, while the public display simply calls it a lady's private thoughts. The real stories are hidden in basements, not on the museum floor. Destruction was sometimes deliberate. At Abydos, workers smashed murals showing punishments and buried the fragments. At Saqqara, archaeologists found branding rods melted down for scrap. The site director's notes said it all. Better used for something civilized. Modern technology is starting to pull back the curtain. Spectral imaging reveals erased women in more than half of scanned tomb paintings. DNA analysis shows many servant mummies were actually noble women whose titles were chiseled away. At Deir el-Medina, researchers used AI to reconstruct punishment records from landfill fragments and found these outnumbered love poems by a wide margin. If we stick to the old gold and glory story, we're not just missing details. We're missing real lives, real pain, and the truth about what happened. The blank spaces on tomb walls and the vague museum labels aren't just mistakes. They're part of a long tradition of making women's suffering invisible. Those missing pieces in Egypt's history books aren't accidents. Every erased mural and rewritten scroll hides real women who suffered. CT scans of a Luxor mummy reveal healed nasal cuts, clear evidence of violence that official records tried to hide. Next time you see a temple painting, look for faint outlines at the edges. That shadow? It might be a woman someone tried to erase. While queens shine in history books, ordinary women faced brutal erasures. Most never got tombs or golden statues, just hidden graves and broken bones. Their stories didn't vanish on their own, they were taken from them. If this surprised you, hit like and comment below. Their scars may be hidden, but their silence still speaks. Let's give these women a voice.